The recently deceased congressman and civil rights hero John Lewis said months ago in March atop the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, "Get in good trouble, necessary trouble, and help redeem the soul of America." That statement has reverberated around the justice-minded activist groups in America as a call to action, a call to the revolutionary good trouble that brings about change. And this trouble has been at the center of America since the upheaval of tea into the Boston Harbor in December of 1773. Now, the Boston Tea Party, as it is reverently referred to now, was the product of a long train of abuses by the British soldiers enforcing the laws of the British monarchy. The tensions between colonists and kingsmen had long been rising, and in February of 1770, a group of protesters approached a known loyalist store and began pelting it with rocks. Another citizen fired into the mob, attempting to break up the crowd, but ultimately struck and killed an 11-year-old boy by the name of Christopher Sater. More conflicts like these helped the tensions boil over into the Boston Massacre nearly a year later. British soldiers, meant to keep the king's peace and protect the people, fired into an angry crowd of protesters. As is typical of how history comes to be written, there is confusion over whether there was or was not an order given to fire into the crowd. But regardless of whether procedure was in place and being followed, citizens died. The soldiers present, who fired on the crowd that was armed with nothing but snowballs, were tried and found not guilty. Captain Thomas Preston, the ranking officer present at the massacre, wrote on the conflict saying, quote, "None of them was a hero. The victims were troublemakers who got more than they deserved, and the soldiers were professionals who shouldn't have panicked. The whole thing should not have happened," end quote. Brutal conflicts between citizens and law enforcement led to the Boston Tea Party. Disguised as Native Americans, many men boarded docked ships and threw an estimated 342 chests of tea into the harbor. Now, these chests were not small either. They're not the small cartons of containers that we might think of. Each chest had to be split open and thrown over, as they held more than 90,000 pounds of tea leaves each. Each chest would have been equal to $1 million in money today, each chest. And this celebrated event in our nation's history resulted in an estimated $342 million of property damage. But this good trouble was a precursor to events like the Declaration of Independence, the formation of the Continental Congress, and the ultimate war that decided the American Revolution's fate. Now, when I look at how protesters nowadays are talked about, I can't help but notice a contradiction between our history and our present and the way we view them. Whether the destruction of property is right, I grew up learning about the Tea Party as a symbol of patriotic pride, the destruction of property which was valued more than the lives of the colonist citizens. It stands now in history as a message of defiance in the face of dehumanization and oppression. But when protesters nowadays who advocate for equal treatment are beaten and taken away in unmarked vans by federal soldiers, I hear that they had it coming, or that they shouldn't have been out protesting in the first place. So many are dismissive of the plight of today's protesters, those whom John Lewis, the hero of the civil rights movement, told to get into good trouble. Many even cite how far civil rights for minorities have come as a reason against more protest. We hear, shouldn't they be happy with what they have? Society has come such a long way. Why are they continuing to complain? It is with that same attitude that I myself used to read today's text from Exodus. In other texts like Numbers, similar stories appear where the Israelites' complaining is met with a stern, unforgiving response from God. And it's often easy for us to read these stories about the Israelites as them not being grateful for what little they do have and how they need to change their attitude and not trouble the waters. But here in this text, they were hungry and in the wilderness. They had been liberated from enslavement, but they were still a marginalized people with no home, no land to call their own, no land to till, no place to find shelter. Their current condition was beyond unstable. That uncertainty, that lack of security that is found when basic human needs like food, shelter, and dignity aren't met, almost always causes unrest among those who are being marginalized to that degree. And in the case of the Israelites, their unrest is manifested in a protest against Moses, Aaron, and ultimately God. Quite often, our reaction as readers to this is negative. We wonder why these Israelites aren't more grateful. God brought them out of Egypt. Shouldn't they be thankful for how far they've come? Why are they still complaining? The fact of the matter is they are complaining and protesting because their basic needs are still not being met. While they have come a long way since Egypt, progress has not happened quickly. Just because they were emancipated doesn't mean they suddenly became an equally treated group, suddenly did not mean that their marginalization and oppression ended. And out of that fact, they challenge the status quo because it is simply still not meeting the needs of their community. So they protest. And in their protest, they are so bold as to point out that at least in their state of slavery, they were being fed. Now, this could be seen as an insult to God. So what does God do in response? Well, God does something counterintuitive to the natural instinct of maybe reminding them how grateful they should be. Instead of reminding them who it was by a slap on the wrist, God reminds them who brought them out of Egypt by meeting their needs. And meeting their needs in an abundant way. Not only does God provide meat every evening and manna every morning, but God even provides them in double on the sixth day so that they may rest on the seventh. God meets their needs abundantly rather than reminding them of how far they've come. God continues to make sure their current basic needs are met. And rather than being the praise-driven monarch that King George has been portrayed as, God moves in a selfless manner that is becoming of the leaders of that community. Psalm 72 in our Bible and in Jewish culture is the qualifier for a monarch and a leader within the Israelite community, saying, "Give the king your justice, O God. May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. May he defend the cause of the poor of the people and give deliverance to the needy and crush the oppressor." This foundational prayer of guidance and support provides a basis of morality out of which a ruler or leader in the Israelite community should do their leading. The psalm continues saying, "For he, the leader, delivers the needy when they call, and the poor and those who have no helper." The Israelites call and God answers. They protest, and God meets the needs that they demand because it is the just and righteous thing to do. They stir up good trouble in order to change the status quo, and out of their good trouble, they are met with their needs. Jesus embodies this ethic in his feeding of the 4,000 in Matthew 15. As we read, Jesus, prompted solely by compassion, feeds the hungry crowd, taking what seemed like a little and feeding many. Jesus provides in the same abundant way that God does in our Exodus story today. Both provide what is needed, Jesus and God, with more than enough to spare. The abundance shown here is something that is easily missed. God in Exodus provides enough daily and twice as much on the sixth day so that there may be rest on the seventh. And Jesus has enough food left over to fill 7 baskets, a symbolic gesture to the creation story and our own creative potential as humans to feed and to change the world. God created this world so that we might all have what we need. If that is the case, then the fact that inequality persists to this day, thousands of years after Jesus' life, should rightly result in unrest and in good trouble that will challenge that status quo. Whatever the reason may be, needs are still not being met. Inequity and injustice transform themselves in new ways and continue to marginalize people across the globe. Protests in our country have continued all summer in response to the enduring inequality in our nation. And again, I am confounded by the response. In a country founded on disruptive protest and revolution, how can those who cause good trouble, necessary trouble, be seen as ungrateful? As a country that defied its own oppressors by destroying their property and presents those moments in reverent remembrance as patriotism nowadays, how do we now write off protest movements as being wrong? How can we justify, as people of the God of Moses, the enduring inequality by trying to remind the oppressed people of how far they've come, while there is still such a long way to go? Perhaps all these questions would be rendered irrelevant if we started asking other questions. Questions like, how can we meet the basic needs of all who are around us? What can those who have more sacrifice in service of those who don't have the same? How can we better join protesters with compassion and care for their needs? How can we actively work, as Jesus did, to preemptively address the needs around us so that good trouble, necessary trouble, is not needed to create change, because change is already happening? How can we do the hard and persistent work so that we can create change for the world, rather than waiting for social progress to roll in passively on the wheels of inevitability? Amen.